call this meeting to order. This will be our budget kickoff, fiscal year 26-27. Today is January 15th, 2026. Just a quick reminder, we're tight for room and microphones, so we will be sharing. And with that, I will hand the meeting over to County Administrator, Mr. Mokrycki.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Good morning, and everyone who's joined us from Lane County and any visitors that we may have this morning. This is our annual leadership team meeting to kick off our budget process for the fiscal year 26-27. We had a work session with the board back in December in this room, which we don't typically do, to sort of talk specifically about the general fund. And today will be the more formal kickoff. We will talk about the general fund, but we'll talk about all of our funds. And we have a lot of information today. But as we typically have done over the last several years, we've invited our state economist for Lane County, Brian Rooney, to join us and help kick us off to give a lay of the land of both the state and local economy here in Lane County. So Brian, I'd like to introduce you to kick us off today.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me. I guess we'll get going here and try and stay on time. Today, we're going to talk about employment and unemployment trends, workforce trends, housing affordability, and projections. We just came out with new projections for 2024 and 2034. First, employment and unemployment. Lane County employment has slowly declined after almost reaching pre-pandemic levels. So Lane County lost 25,900 jobs, or 16%, in the spring of 2020, and it gained back 25,500, or 98% of those jobs, by January of 2025. As of September, employment dropped 2,300, or 1.4% from January's peak, and that little peak there is January's peak. That was the post-pandemic peak, and we've been kind of dropping off since then. Statewide, Oregon lost 14% between January and April of 2020, and had topped pre-pandemic levels by January 2023. As of September 2025, employment had dropped 12,100, or 0.6%, from the recent peak, the post-pandemic peak. So similar trends between the state and Lane County. Okay, so this is employment change over the year from September 2024 to 2025. And employment is slightly negative over the past year. Total employment is down 900, or negative 0.5% over the year. And you can see that a lot of industries are either flat or have very small losses. And it's been kind of bouncing around from month to month for each industry. A couple of industries stand out. Professional and business services has a large decline in September. A lot of that is call centers are kind of becoming a thing of the past. It used to be a pretty big part of Lane County's economy. So they're kind of going away, losing jobs. And also temporary firms are in there, and they're doing fine, but they're just not as popular. They're not growing like they used to. The big increase here is in private education and health services. And that's mostly health services. That's been growing and has been steady growth for a while now. And it's similar to the statewide in that health services is pretty much carrying any kind of employment growth. Leisure and hospitality is doing well in Lane County. Those high profile track and field meets seem to give it a bump whenever those happen. And then government is down by 500. About 100 of that loss is federal government, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The rest is mostly local education, including the University of Oregon, which had some published layoffs earlier this year. Okay, so about federal government. We had been getting a lot of questions about federal government employment. You know, first we had DOGE, and then we had the shutdown. So before all that happened, in the fourth quarter of 2024, and we chose the fourth quarter because it's seasonally neutral. It's kind of in between the summer peak and the winter bottom for federal government employment. Anyway, in the fourth quarter of 2024, there were roughly 2,000 federal jobs in Lane County. U.S. Postal Service is usually one of the larger ones in any region. But we have Department of Veteran Affairs because of the VA hospital. And then Department of Agriculture is forestry. Department of Interior is BLM. So quite a few jobs in basically forestry management. And then we also have Homeland Security here because we have an airport. So these jobs accounted for about 1.2% of all jobs in Lane County, and that compares to 1.8% of all jobs in the state, so relatively small employment overall. Rural counties tend to have a higher share of their employment in federal government. Sherman County has the highest share at 15%. Not a huge proportion of employment, but they pay well. Annual average pay for federal jobs in Lane County was $88,293 in 2024, and that was about 50% higher than the average for all jobs in Lane County at $59,020. So the federal government data that we have now is incomplete because of the shutdown, and we're just catching up on a lot of the data that comes out of government. But we do have claims for unemployment for federal workers. And this time around, it's looking like we're not going to get as many claims as we have for some of the larger shutdowns in the past. I believe this one is 2013, and this was late 2018. 2018, early 2019. So, and I'm pretty sure this is complete because this was the first week of December. These are continuing claims that could rise some, but it looks like we're not getting as many claims from federal government in this shutdown. As I said, we're going to have more complete data going forward when we get the payroll data from the federal government.
The two different lines there?
The dark line is federal employees who are veterans. So unemployment rates have slowly increased from near record lows. So Lane County September 2025 rate was 5.0, up from 4.3 in September 2024. So a significant increase over the year, and is down from the high of 4.2 in April 2020. Lane County's record low rate is 3.5%, set in November 2019, and was 3.6% in May of 2023. So here we have the record lows, pre-pandemic, record high during the pandemic. Then we came right back down to near record lows here. Since then, Lane County and Oregon, and federal to a lesser extent, have been kind of drifting up month after month. So over the past couple of years, we've had this significant increase in the unemployment rate. Oregon's statewide rate was 5.2% in September, and the U.S. unemployment rate was 4.4% in November. So what's going on? We're looking at the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, and that's an informal survey of major employers across the country. And the Beige Book over the past couple of months has pointed to subdued hiring and artificial intelligence starting to affect the labor force. So in October, more employers reported lowering headcounts through layoffs and attrition. And they reported weaker demand, elevated economic uncertainty, and in some cases, increased investment in artificial intelligence technologies. That economic uncertainty, I think, is an important one there. There's been a lot of uncertainty. First, the tariffs and kind of the inconsistent implementation of the tariffs. And then the Federal Reserve and which way they're going to go with interest rates. Normally, they'll raise interest rates to quell inflation or lower interest rates to support employment growth. They could go either way right now. And then finally, the government shutdown. You know, we have a couple of months there where we had no data, no statistics or partial statistics or delayed statistics. And, you know, companies do use those government statistics to help make decisions. So that contributed to the uncertainty. As we go into November, it's more about limiting headcounts through hiring freezes, replacement-only hiring, attrition, rather than through layoffs. And employers adjusted hours to accommodate higher or lower expected business volume instead of adjusting the number of employees. So that's where we're kind of seeing this no hire, no fire situation. And it's, you know, it's just kind of a very mundane labor market right now. We're not seeing rapid growth. We're seeing slowing, maybe some losses, but it's not going anywhere fast in most cases. But also in November, firms noted artificial intelligence replaced entry-level positions or made existing workers productive enough to curb new hiring. So AI looks like it's starting to work its way into the labor force. Workforce trends. So vacancies are below pre-pandemic levels. So this green here is 2025. And if you look at it, it's just the vacancy level is just about as low as it was during the pandemic. So this kind of gets into that no hire, no fire situation that we're seeing. So these are private sector vacancies. Vacancies are lower than the summer of 2024 compared to the summer of 2025. So down 31%, that's pretty significant. There were roughly 1.9 unemployed persons per vacancy in the summer of 2025. That's higher than the 1.1% in the summer of 2024. And that 1.9% of unemployed persons per vacancy historically isn't that high. It's fairly normal. So labor supply going forward, retirements. Retirements really, as a reason for someone not being in the labor force, increased pretty dramatically over the past decade, rose 20%, 27% over the past decade. And in recent years, it's leveled off a little bit, but it's at a very high level. And this is at the statewide level. But yeah, retirements are a big thing with the labor supply. Those baby boomer retirements are in full swing. Okay, so more unemployed for different reasons. This is reasons for unemployment. I'm going to focus up first on the purple, are job losers. And, you know, you can see down here, good economy, their job losers level was relatively low. Over the past couple of years, year and a half, though, it's been increasing fairly rapidly. And another interesting thing about this are the new entrants, this light blue, and that's been increasing recently also. Some of that is our older people getting back into the labor force. And when you enter the labor force and you're looking for work but you don't have a job, you're counted as unemployed. So we're seeing 55 plus kind of elevate and bring up some of that newer entrants reason for being unemployed. Oregon and Lane County may have lost some advantage as an attractor. This has to do with in-migration. So these are decadal averages, annual averages over a decade. And, you know, here you can see net migration's fairly strong in the 90s up to 2000. And we had some natural increase. Natural increase is births, less deaths. Moving forward, in-migration is down, and so is natural increase. 2010 to 2020, in-migration came back a little bit, and that was a really good economy. That was the recovery from the Great Recession, so that was just a decade-long recovery. And when you get a long economic recovery like that, people tend to move. They see opportunity, they feel confident to change their position, move, get a new job. So that's what's going on there. Natural increase is practically zero there. And now we go to the last 4 years. In-migration is down, natural increase is negative, and on an annual average basis, we're losing 50 people in population per year. So we lost 200 over that 4-year period. Problem is, Oregon and Lane County depend on in-migration to grow the labor force. Obviously, natural increase isn't doing it. So that leads to some difficulty in hiring and in the labor market.
Yes, Ms. Rooney, we got a question.
Quick
Yeah.
question. Do we have data anywhere about the age range of folks who are in-migrating? In other words, how much of that is people retiring here, which wouldn't necessarily feed the workforce?
I can look into that. That's a good point. Right, there are some counties that are having immigration. Douglas County is one of them. West Oregon is generally retirees moving in, what immigration they have.
Yes.
A quick follow-up on that is, and you don't need to answer this right now, but people moving here to live here but still continue their work elsewhere, working online.
Yeah, that's true, and that's hard to get a handle on. It's, our data is pretty much is where their paycheck comes from. So, somebody could be working here, living at home, working from home, but being paid in Wichita or someplace, and their employment would be in Wichita.
Yeah, but their spending would be here.
Yeah, but they're part of the population in migration statistic also.
I'm curious, and no need for an answer at this point in time, how much does that affect their overall numbers, kind of skew the numbers incorrectly? But,
My sense is not a whole lot, yeah, very small. I mean, it's still pretty traditional. People live where they work.
Thank you.
So, our workforce in Lane County is less diverse than the nation. We can see we're more white, but we're gaining with the Hispanic and Latino ethnicity. So our workforce is diversifying rapidly in recent years. This is since 2021. And Hispanic and Latino ethnicity has been adding a lot of people to the workforce, large percentage increase. White has added some. Actually, a couple of years ago, that was negative. In recent years, white has added some, but the percentage increase is very low. And then the other races have high percentage increases over that time period. So we're diversifying. To the right there are unemployment rates by race or Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, third quarter of 2025. This is another statistic that was delayed because of the shutdown. And then you can see that over the year, most of these haven't changed. Black and African American, though, was up a couple of points. Housing affordability. So the income gap with the U.S. persists, but it's improving. So, and this is another statistic that was delayed because of the shutdown, but this one won't change much. So over the past decade, we're 80% of the per capita personal income of the United States. We've improved to 90%. So we're seeing some improvement there. But in housing costs, they've risen dramatically, and particularly on the affordable end. And this isn't just a problem in Lane County. This is the West Coast. This is a regional thing. But you can see that the green bar here, or the green line, is the Lane County median. And it really kind of separated from the U.S., which is the black bar, the black line here, between, say, 2014 and 2022. And it's recently leveled off. At the bottom third, which is this dashed line for Lane County, it actually increased enough to catch up with the nationwide median, and that's our bottom third of housing costs. And then at the national level, the bottom third increased at a much slower pace. So housing affordability, cost of housing is a problem in Lane County and all along the West Coast. Some of this has to do with supply of housing. Residential building permits were up in 2024. And it takes, we calculate about 1,400 units to keep up with population growth. Now, we saw that population is actually declining recently. That 1,400 might come down a little bit, but in recent years, for several years, we've kept up or surpassed that 1,400. And 2024 was one of those years. 2025 is partial data. Again, because of the government shutdown, it's delayed. This is through August in 2025. And it doesn't look like we're going to get up to 2024 levels. I mean, we're over halfway through the year, and it looks like we're going to not make 2024 levels. And we might not make that 1,400 units in 2025. Okay, our projections. So first off, Oregon Employment Department doesn't publish short-term forecast or projection of employment, but the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis does. And Oregon will gain 11,400 jobs, or 0.5% jobs over the next year. That's very slow growth. You can see here statewide, here's that little drop that we've been seeing in Lane County, and OEA is expecting that we're going to make back that small drop over the next year. But very slow growth is projected. For Lane County, jobs are projected to increase 6% by 2034. So this is the projections for 2024 to 2034. The projections are influenced primarily by structural growth, and that's just to say that we're no longer recovering from the pandemic recession. It's now going forward, this is structural growth that affects demand in an industry. First off, health service, private education and health services, almost all health services, adds the most jobs and has the highest percentage increase. Just the aging of the population creates demand for health services, and that should continue for a while. Business and professional and business services is kind of interesting here. There's actually some growth, job growth, because of artificial intelligence included there. That includes software development, but also consultants that'll, right now we're seeing a lot of companies that will consult people and take a look at their particular situation and tell them how AI can benefit them. Also, data processing is in there. So AI helps professional and business services come along. Construction is also up. There's, room to grow in housing, and also we're seeing some commercial renovations. Just construction is expected to be healthy over the next few years. And also architect and engineering is in professional and business services, so that helps that one. Leisure and hospitality has done well in Lane County, is expected to continue to do well. As we go down the line, local government, where local education is expected to grow, but much slower than in the past. The school-age population is declining as we go forward, so we're expecting to see some job losses in local education. Federal government is down also, and it's only down 100. We don't know what future administrations are going to do, but we're seeing some efficiencies in the Postal Service, and also we have the cuts this year that are kind of baked into the forecast. For one kind of interesting thing this go around for federal government, state government in Lane County, and natural resources and mining, even though they're not growing a lot, there was a little bump up there for wildland firefighting. We're expecting there to be some employment growth over the next decade for that. Okay, these are occupational projections by very broad categories. So services is, very large and expected to grow, so adding the most jobs. Most of these occupational sectors go along with the industries that they're in. But the thing about this is the replacement openings. So the gold tabs on the end here are growth openings, and that's what we saw in the previous slide with the industries. The blue are replacement openings, and there are two types of replacement openings. There are exits, and that's when somebody actually leaves the labor force, largely from retirements, and transfers, and that's when somebody makes a major occupational change. So it's not turnover. Turnover is like when a cashier is working at a store and finds a job that pays a little more and works at that store as a cashier. That's turnover. Transfer is when that cashier maybe goes to college, gets a degree, and becomes a nuclear physicist. So leaves the cashier position, and it's kind of a permanent opening. It's a transfer opening. At any rate, the replacement openings are expected to create opportunity in the future, and largely through retirements going forward. Okay, well, that's it. There's my contact information. I'm told the QR code still works. So there's our website, and we have a subscription service if you'd like to get our data in the email. And questions and comments?
Yes, do we have any questions for Mr. Rooney? Commissioners first. Anybody from the table? Okay, absolutely.
Not a question so much. I'm just, one comment I want to make. It's going to be really interesting to follow the emergence of AI. I mean, we're doing it here interim, looking at our technology services director, but of course that tells us nothing about the quality of the work or the customer experience, just that that's happening. So just noting that. I have two comments that might be questions. One is, do you have any sense with the increase in construction? Of course, we want that to be housing, but I imagine you said it does include renovations and so on, so there's a lot of repurposing of commercial buildings post-pandemic, right?
Yes.
And then we have a lot of aging infrastructure in Lane County. I mean, we're looking at that ourselves, so there's a lot of construction that is actually not new construction, but
Yes.
so is there a place where that's broken out, the difference between new construction and renovation or building rehabilitation?
No, that's just pretty much general structural.
Or housing
trends
versus commercial?
going
No.
forward, yeah.
And then the increase in healthcare sector jobs, is there somewhere where that's further broken down by type, specialty care, hospital care, long-term
Yes.
care?
Yes, a lot of that is residential care. A lot of the growth in healthcare is residential care right now. Hospitals, or so they're changing structurally, and we're seeing some job losses. Especially, we're expecting some losses at rural hospitals. There's cuts to Medicaid, so that could put a damper on healthcare employment.
And I'm thinking about that in, the correlation of increased retirement, retirees with need for certain kinds of health services, but then also what the wages are within those particular subsets of the healthcare industry, right? An orthopedic surgeon is not the same as a CNA in a long-term care facility when it comes to wages. So is there a place on your website or that I could get in touch with you to find a little bit of crosswalk about some of those things?
Yeah, you can look up the healthcare industry, and I can help you with this, but you can look at the occupations within the healthcare industry, and we have wages. And you're right, for healthcare, there's going to be a really huge difference between the top and the bottom. As you say, you got surgeons, and then you have residential care folks that are all included in that industry.
And then do you also have that broken down by demographic as far as who's in those jobs?
I believe so. I don't think it goes to quite that detail. I think we can look at the healthcare industry and look at demographics, but I don't know how detailed we can go.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, absolutely. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rooney, it's always a pleasure to see you. You always give wonderful news, good news, bad news, indifferent. It's always good news. It's well received. That QR code takes us directly to the survey, which I maxed you on, and I would encourage everybody to do the same. How easy would it be to bring up the housing slide again? Could you quickly do that?
Go back there.
And that's the housing value.
Right.
We've all seen the alarming increase in housing value, but Commissioner Trierad and I had a little aside about how houses are still far more expensive in California. So you sell one there, buy two here, rent one to Airbnb, and off you go. It increases the sales of housing here, but it does not do anything for the local economy directly, or marginally so.
Marginally, yeah.
But my illustration of the point was actually, I think the next slide gives me a better point. The barcode slide.
Oh, okay, the building permits.
There we go, yeah. I'll say this again, and it's not news to anybody in this room, we're falling behind continually on all levels of housing, whether it be the $1 million houses or the entry-level 50 front doors per acre houses. Very important that we do every single thing that we can do to maximize dense urban growth inside our metropolitan areas, while at the same time doing everything we can outside of the urban growth boundaries. In order for us to continue to increase density inside the urban growth boundaries, we have to do the best we can on the outside. That's just a point I like to make on a regular basis. We're not going to solve the housing crisis in rural Lane County. It's not going to be solved, but it is going to help what happens to densify our designated metropolitan areas. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chair and Vice Chair. I'm Mary, I'm the assessor and tax collector of Lane County. And what we're seeing with subdivisions is it mirrors what you're saying. The permits in 2025 have softened compared to 24. And what we're seeing with subdivisions are there's fewer subdivisions being recorded, and when they are recorded, they're not developing at the rate that they were some years ago. So there's vacant lots that aren't being developed, and so I just thought I'd add that to the conversation.
Yeah.
And we are with the construction, with that slide and that industry, we're keeping an eye on things like the Amazon distribution center that's coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. And also the affordable housing. There are projects throughout Lane County, specifically in Eugene, that are coming online too. Those will probably be exempt, but they will help the housing issue.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of affordable housing coming on all around the state, just recently over the past several months.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So I just had a quick question. In one of your slides, I don't remember exactly which one it was. Lane County jobs are expected to increase by 6%.
Yeah.
What is an average per year?
Historically, during a recovery, we'll see 1.5% per year, like between 2010 and 2020, that type of recovery. And then, that gets interrupted with a recession. And then normally we'll go back to something like that. Right now, we're seeing very slow growth, 0.5% per year, or in the case of Lane County, slightly negative. So, yeah, just 0.5% is a year, or 5% over 6% over 10 years. 0.6% annualized. It's very slow growth.
Okay, well, if that's it for Mr. Rooney, I believe I'll hand it back over to you, Mr. Mokrajewski.
Thank you, Chair. And now we have, thank you, Mr. Rooney, for,
thank you.
For your presentation. Now we have Steve Adams, our Policy Director, who is going to give us a state and federal Legislative update, we have a short session we're heading into here with the legislature. You may think that would mean that there's not a lot happening. Of course, there's a lot that we're monitoring both at the state level. The state has some budgetary challenges, and counties across the state are asking for a lot of things too because we are challenged. I'll just remind the board and those who are here and watching that Lane County and county budgets across Oregon and really generally speaking across the country are heavily reliant on state and federal dollars, whereas cities rely mostly on local taxes and fees. In Lane County, 60% of our budget is state and federal dollars, 40% is local taxes and fees. And so when we see the federal government making reductions to programs and funding, we see the state government making reductions and shifting in priorities or increasing in certain areas, as we'll talk about later, we see major impacts on county government. So and we're continuing to monitor. 2025 was a really challenging year, of course, both at the state, but particularly at the federal level with a lot of uncertainty. You may have seen, if you saw the news that came out yesterday, we had a little bit of whiplash from an announcement that $2 billion in SAMHSA funding, this was funding for substance abuse and mental health services from the federal government, was eliminated by the administration, and then within a matter of hours, that statement was reversed. We believe because of a lot of pressure from locals and states, really broad pressure for that. So we say that just to make the point that there continues to be uncertainty and things continue to, the threat of things changing and impacting services here in our local community and within our organization that we provide is real. And we continue to monitor that, and we'll be as thoughtful as we can in responding, but it's just a note in particular to the community that, you know, these type of things can happen fast, and it's very difficult to predict. Nobody predicted that there was going to be like that, a proposal to eliminate, I think it was $2 billion in SAMHSA funding. So, Mr. Adams.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mokroheinski, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners. A pleasure to be with you this morning. And I think just providing this broader context and trying to flesh out a bit of what Mr. Mokroheinski just gave you an overview of. You know, we looked back on the last year, 2025, a new administration, a new Congress, in a year of great turbulence in terms of the typical status quo for federal funds and the impacts at the states level across the 50 states, and then that trickling down to all of the local government budgets, ours included. The 25, I think, was really a year of very significant executive branch actions, a lot of grant cancellations, a lot of changing regulations, a lot of programs essentially kind of being zeroed out. Certainly, we had the era of DOGE, as Mr. Rooney was referencing on the job side. We were seeing this on the dollar side in terms of how that was flowing into the local government, state government coffers. We came in this time last year, we knew there was likely to be significant legislation, and that did in fact pass. After kind of the first phase of executive branch, we saw the legislative branch moving forward with that particular position. And, you know, the 119th Congress, of which we're going into the second half, has had narrow majorities on the Republican side, particularly in the House, and that has narrowed even more significantly. What I think we've seen towards the end of 2025 is the kind of movement, really into the judiciary. We're seeing a significant number of court cases now that is kind of on a wide range of issues. Mr. Rooney noted tariffs, and that is certainly being litigated, has been argued in front of the Supreme Court. We're not really sure how that is going to land. That Oregon has a very export-oriented economy, and tariffs impacted us from a statewide revenue perspective. But many of the kind of changes in regulations, many of the kind of grant programs, many of the kind of new federal guidance that has been attached to existing grants changes even to the fundamental base regulations that govern all federal grants, inserting new clauses for termination for convenience for every federal grant, right? It's massive changes in ways that only perhaps some of the details are really kind of only what bureaucrats can love. 2025 was a year of significant uncertainty. I think many of us were thinking maybe 2026 was going to be a little bit less uncertain with respect to what things were likely to be. So we've seen kind of a stabilization on the executive branch action, I think, is what many of us were thinking over the holidays and thinking, what is 2026 going to bring? The courts working through some of the issues, but as Mr. Mokry said, we've had just a bit of a fire drill in the last 48 hours. So on the congressional side, just kind of where we are now, the Congress is working against a deadline for the current continuing resolution, which expires on the 30th of January. I think over the holidays, the sense was that both parties did not want to shut down government again. There was agreement that it was important that the federal government conclude its business by that time, and we get appropriations bills through. You'll recall at the conclusion of the shutdown, we created this continuing resolution out to January 30th, but Congress also appropriated federal fiscal $26 for agriculture, defense, construction, and the legislative branch. That was part of that appropriation. So the SNAP benefits shutdown that occurred late last year will not be repeated. If Congress doesn't come to an appropriation solution by January 30th, you can see a partial government shutdown, right? Some agencies that don't have appropriation bills passed would shut down. But the sense is that it's quite likely that you would see, if they don't conclude business, another continuing resolution to try to move that through. Congress is working now. I think the sense over the holidays was that Congress was going to move what they're calling mini buses as opposed to omnibuses, little small packages, 3 appropriations bills at a time. And so many of these our lobby team in DC, Smith Garson, are telling us have been kind of almost pre-conference between the House and the Senate. So they're being passed, and the expectation is that they will continue to move along. So we've got a handful of those passed by the House and awaiting action in the Senate. However, we've seen, I think, some of that consensus about, or at least prognostication as to what the appropriations process was going to look like in January, did not take into account some of the events the last couple of weeks in the foreign policy sphere and in domestic actions as well. And so we're seeing more turbulence within the legislative process. The House is operating with only a 2-member working margin right now. So the Speaker has a very challenging job to try to move legislation through the House of Representatives. And we're seeing this legislative maneuver called a discharge petition. When a majority of members says we want to vote on a bill, they can bring it to the floor, and we're seeing more and more of these kinds of activities. So the Affordable Care Act subsidy, which expired at the end of December, was actually passed out of the House on a discharge petition. So there's that legislation is now pending. There's negotiations in the Senate, and there's some sense that maybe we'll see action on that in the next few years, or next few weeks, sorry. Of course, on the state side, the short session begins on the 2nd of February. I think the story of the legislative session this year for the short session really is very focused on the state's financial position. We came out of the long session with an appropriations package that essentially had about 500 million in the general fund as an ending fund reserve, right? That was the balance at the end. And that's meant to be a bit of a carryover going into the next biennial budget. By September of '25, and the difference is that Congress had enacted H.R. 1, and Oregon's personal and corporate income taxes are automatically tied to the federal IRS tax code. We saw a net reduction and a deficit of $372 million. So that 500 to the plus went from 500 to the plus to 327 to the minus. We got a second revenue estimate in December. There was some one-time revenue windfalls is what I understand the majority of that difference is, that brought our deficit up to 63 million, a much better number for the legislature. But the co-chairs of Joint Ways and Means are indicating that they still want to get back to that 500 million end of fund balance, right? So they're still looking for $500 million to reduce. We will get another deficit. We'll get another revenue forecast for the biennium in the first week of session, and that will be the official number that we'll work from. So, there's chatter about what that might be, and who knows what it's going to be. But we're hoping for a much better number. That would be great. The 2025 transportation package, that was a major component of activity for the throughout 2025. It was a major piece that didn't get done in the long session, came back with a special session that had revenue components for local government from the 50-30-20 split with the state transportation fund. And the governor has indicated her desire to see that package repealed. That was referred to voters successfully with a very rapid campaign of signature gathering for the ballot. So that any of the revenues anticipated for that are now kind of on the shelf, and the intent is we'll see some adjustments to avoid state ODOT layoffs is the thought, and then the governor is indicating a desire to take the transportation package up again in 2027. And of course, county government, city government, and our colleagues across the state through our associations, AOC and the League of Cities, are focusing on state and local, trying to preserve the kind of share of state dollars that comes to support these shared services between state and local government. And of course, this is the short session, so we know Sunny Dye can be no later than March 8th. So we have a couple of different levels of impacts, and we have impacts to the revenue picture coming into state government, and we have impacts or reductions specifically to federally supported programs that help with the cost share of vital services here within Oregon. This first graph was prepared by the Legislative Revenue Office last year, looking specifically at H.R. 1. And these, you'll see, are the income tax provisions that really impacted Oregon's revenue from taxes. And you'll see that the way this is structured, this is both on the individual income tax side, as well as on the corporate income tax side. You'll see that in that first line, personal provisions, you'll see that the impacts are largely in the 25-27 biennium, and you see them beginning to recede in 27-29 and 29-31. And so those are the provisions that sunset in a short amount of time, right? Whereas on the business provisions, those are now made permanent, and those will be permanent features of the tax code unless the legislature decides that they want to decouple. Yes, Chair.
I have an academic question. I'm sure SALT is not Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty.
No, Chair, Commissioner, that is state and local taxes.
Thank you.
And that had previously been capped. That was expanded out. Now, this is a net position, and of course, our economy is dynamic, right? So when you put money into consumers' hands, they tend to spend it, and we get new revenue, right? So that's the difference between the numbers you see here and the net impacts that we're seeing in the general fund.
Thank you. Maybe you were about to launch into this because, right, Commissioner Farr's important question, just you said on the business provisions, those are permanent, and that's due to the connect versus disconnect discussion, right? Isn't that what you were just starting to say? And so my question is then, is that right? And then what happens if Oregon chooses to disconnect to those lines?
So, Chair, Commissioner Trieger, indeed. So this analysis assumes no disconnection. Within the federal tax code, those personal provisions sunset. So the 25, the first 25,000 on tips, right? The permanent are made permanent in the federal tax code, right? By HR 1. Those are permanent changes. Now, Oregon's policymakers will have that decision point. Do they want to disconnect from the federal and which they could do on both sides of that?
Right, yeah, and that's exactly what I'm asking. So if that decision were to be made, those provisions would exist but would not be permanent, or even those amounts the dollar amounts would look different as well. It's not just a matter of whether they're permanent or not, it's about the actual formula and the credits, right?
Chair, Commissioner, that's exactly
Okay.
right. Both of those would be true.
And is that a decision that is made during a legislative session? So that's either going to be made by March 8th or not?
Chair, Commissioner, that's correct.
And is it retroactive?
Chair, Commissioner, I'm told that's not.
Right.
So the 25 tax, many of us are starting to prepare for our income taxes, and it is probably logistically not possible for the Department of Revenue to be able to turn that around.
Be a
So it would be
next
a-
tax year forward. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Indeed, that is the thinking, and there is some discussion within the revenue committees about what, the legislature may wish to do during the short session. Others are thinking maybe it's a long session. Okay, and so that's on the revenue side, and then moving to the next slide, HR 1 also had implications for some of the federal funds that were coming into the state of Oregon specifically. So the benefit changes within HR 1 are really about eligibility. They're really about work and education requirements associated with remaining on SNAP, for instance, or Medicaid, and the impacts specifically within this category of HR 1 impacts to Oregon are, as you will see, growing over the biennium as we look out, and particularly the Medicaid line item in particular. So of course, when we spend $1 that is composed of some of the state money and with a federal match, right? So this is a net reduction of money coming into our state. So the legislature will be working hard to figure out how to manage the Medicaid impact specifically. So we will see more likely than not general fund dollars being moved to help cover some of those. That's a policy decision that the legislature will have to make. And of course, $1 that because goes from one place to another is no longer available to support the previous use. So that will be a key issue that members will be struggling with. So your legislative team will be back a week after next to present the short session principles and priorities for the board and to discuss some of what we're proposing to focus on. But you can imagine that our principal focus for the short session will be on protecting
to the greatest extent we possibly can, the revenues that come into county government from Salem and from DC. And with that, Chair, that's my presentation.
Any questions for Mr. Adams? Commissioner? See none. Any from the table? Well, I would just like to say I had some one-on-one time with Vanessa. We went over these things, and although not the best news, it was greatly appreciated. So I appreciate the time. Okay, that's it. Mr. Mokajski, I think you're up next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Steve, for your presentation. We're doing well on time here. You're scheduled to take a break. So I'll give a sort of and again, we usually start, as we did today, with a high-level overview. So you had a broad state and local economic overview. You've had an update on federal and state legislative and policy matters. And now we're going to start drilling a little bit deeper into Lane County's budget and finances. So first, from a process standpoint, this is the process that we have laid out. This is the same really every year that the timeline that we go through. Today, we're here kicking off, providing an initial overview of what we are projecting for the fiscal year 26-27 Lane County budget, and seeking any initial direction from the board as we begin to work with our departments to establish department budgets and ultimately the proposed budget that will be submitted to the Budget Committee. So we have today. Next week, we'll do department budget kickoff. So we meet with all of our department staff. Many of those folks are here, individuals that work within our departments to develop the budgets. There's a lot of really important and oftentimes unseen work that happens within our departments because the central budget office and I rely on our departments to identify their projected revenues for each year, their projected expenses, to make adjustments based on the direction that we provide them. And then we take all of that individual department work and we meet with departments. So that's the work that's going to happen over the next several months, that we will kick off with our department staff next week. The departments will be given direction on how to develop their budgets. Christine will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The departments will submit their requested budget to the county administrator. The county administrator will then meet with all of the departments to review their requests and make adjustments as necessary based on the projections that we're making in the target budget that we're trying to get to. The county administrator works with the budget team then to finalize that proposed budget, and we'll propose the budget in late April. The budget committee then meets, budget committee comprised of the 5 elected commissioners and your 5 appointed residents in the community. Those 10 individuals meet for about 3 weeks in May to review the proposed budget, and they then approve the budget, and that gets submitted to the Board of Commissioners, and the board ultimately adopts the budget. So by mid-May, the Board of Commissioners will adopt the budget to be effective on July 1st. So that's our process. We usually show some version of this slide. This is kind of an aggregate look at Lane County's budget, big picture look. When we talk about Lane County's budget, I've referred to this in recent years as one thing, that budget document, that really thick document, as though it's one thing that we have right now. We're looking at about 1,944 full-time equivalent positions in Lane County. That's a snapshot, as it does change with each supplemental as we receive new grants and revenue, or as grants and revenue decrease, or funding decreases, and we have to make adjustments. Our total budget for the current fiscal year is just over $1.2 billion from an annual perspective. We have 11 departments in Lane County. That can fluctuate from year to year, but you see, and those departments are all represented here across the table. So that is the aggregate look, but what we're going to do this year is give you a more nuanced, and we've talked about this, we haven't shown you this slide before, and a credit to our great team in the budget office for developing some really outstanding slides, some visuals that we're going to show you to try to tell this story in a more nuanced way. So again, we talk about this budget as though it's one thing, but it's actually a combination of many different parts. I believe we have 33 funds. That number fluctuates each year. You know, we had funds that were tracking ARPA dollars. Those have now gone away. And so, you know, at one point, I think we were at 35 funds. We tend to fluctuate somewhere in the low to mid 30s of the number of funds. But the point here is that, you know, I was so excited about this, and it's not working. I had a toy. I had my own. We didn't have a laser pointer before, and then I brought my own, and it doesn't work. Does this one work? Can you kind of see this? Okay. All right. So this is our budget. When we talk about our budget as being one thing, that is the thing that we talk about. But on the outer loop here, you'll see the different categories of funds, ways in which we categorize. This is, you know, you don't have to memorize all of these things, but I want folks to walk away with an understanding of the complexity of our budget. It is not one thing, and when we talk about we have a budget challenge, it's always we have a series of budget challenges that are created by multiple factors because revenue is coming from different places and expenses are required in different places. So the different types of funds we have, I'll start with special revenue funds. This is where revenue is coming from a particular place and it's dedicated for a particular use. A lot of this is state and federal dollars. So here first you'll see the Health and Human Services. Most of our Health and Human Services budgets are here in this fund. And that's most of our divisions within Health and Human Services. So it's again, state and federal dollars that are coming, and those dollars have to be spent here. We can't reduce a service here and then say, we're gonna take that money and we're gonna put it over here. It has to be spent because it's coming from a specific state or federal source saying you need to spend, we'll give you this money and you need to spend it that way. Conversely, when we see reductions in places as we have, and we've seen a number of reductions in funding in our Health and Human Services Department, largely from state and federal dollars, we then have to make reductions here. So I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows our full-time equivalent, our positions changes over the last 10 years or so. You'll see growth for about 10 years and now steady decline that's happening. For many years, we saw growth that was driven in Lane County that was driven by increases in state and federal priorities. When Medicaid expansion was adopted in the mid-2000s, mid-2010s, and then Oregon participated in that and really, you know, has been a national leader in terms of making sure that we're providing health services, comprehensive health services to residents in our community. Now we're starting to see the impacts of, you know, of those changes in terms of reductions in areas like public health, developmental disabilities, and human services. We're seeing those corrections as well. The road fund is a special revenue fund, again, largely state dollars coming from gas taxes and vehicle registration fees here. This was looking good up until recently when the transportation package, the threat to refer to voters, and you saw again, as Mr. Adams referenced, the governor's request to pull that back, and we hope that the legislature will work at some point on a new package. But this fund, the road fund, is now, as you'll see in a minute, on our list of distressed funds because we don't have the revenue necessary to meet the infrastructure needs that we have in our road system. Special revenue funds, and I'm gonna try to quickly go through all these, again, not for a memorization perspective, but really just to understand the different places the funds are coming from and the different obligations that we have. Special revenue fund includes a number of sub-funds, so you'll see parole and probation, the sheriff's office contracts, are there. So what others that you wanna call out?
It's just smaller programs. I mean, like our Fire Defense Board in Technology Services, so small pieces that are.
Here you see Human Services, so this is a part of Health and Human Services that is actually is part of a separate fund. Public Safety Levy is our 290, so this is the levy that is not in the general fund. It's actually in its own separate fund. The Parks Levy fund is here, and then we get into some much smaller ones. So these are our special revenue funds. Funding coming largely from state and federal dollars and a couple of local levies. that are restricted in their use and so accounted for separately. Internal service funds, these are going to be largely various internal services, but I'll call out specifically, you see the largest one here, employee benefits. So things like health insurance for employees, PERS expenses, dental expenses, Social Security and Medicare, deferred compensation, life insurance, paid family medical leave. All of those employee benefit expenses are represented here in this internal service fund. Additionally, this is the fleet fund, so all of our vehicles, for the sheriff's office, for waste management, for roads, and for other areas. You see the fleet fund. Technology services is here. We have our PERS bond. We have a PERS bond that's referenced here, the risk fund, and then TS equipment. Okay, so these are internal service funds. Of course, we're all very familiar with the general fund. So this is where, and I'll just point out the general fund, again, is the fund where the Board of Commissioners has the greatest flexibility and discretion. This is where all of our local property tax dollars, with the exception of these two levies, public safety levy and the parks levy, this is where all of our property tax dollars go. The 11 cents on the dollar, 11 to 12 cents on the dollar that we keep from the total dollar that the assessor collects. The close to 90 cents on the dollar gets distributed to the other 84 taxing districts in Lane County, the cities, the school districts, fire districts, special districts. So this is where we have discretion. And typically the general fund, when every city, county, and state government has a general fund. And they most have some version of these types of funds. You won't see, I don't believe, the size of the special revenue funds at a city government that you would see in a county government, because this is where all the state and federal dollars are. City governments are not as heavily reliant on those funding sources. You'll typically see a larger general fund in a city government, and even in county governments in Lane County, we'll touch on that. This is where the board has discretion. You can spend general fund dollars really where you see fit. We historically have always spent them on the most basic fundamental services that the county provides, law enforcement, public safety, our sheriff's office, district attorney's office, our general government areas. We talk about assessment and taxation, deeds and records, elections, all of those areas that is primarily where the general fund is. About over 70% of our general fund is spent on public safety related services. The next is general government for those statutorily required areas that I mentioned, assessment, taxation, deeds and records, and elections. And then some central services that help support the rest of the organization, and those costs get charged out to other departments. Enterprise funds here, solid waste. You see our solid waste fund. This is, again, one of our distressed funds that we'll talk about. Lane Event Center and land management are our three enterprise funds, and then we get into capital funds and debt service. So thank you for indulging me in that kind of walk through the spin wheel of the complexity of Lane County's budget, again, to articulate this point that it is one document that is comprised of, at this point, about 33 different parts. So it's complex and nuanced, and it requires complex and nuanced conversations. So here is a list of the distressed funds. So within all of those funds that we briefly walked through, you'll see the places that we need to narrow in and really focus on as part of our budget conversations. At the top of the list, you'll see the general fund. I'll spend a minute here talking about why is the general fund so distressed here in Lane County and the challenges we face there. But again, the general fund is where our property tax dollars go, and there's a long history of a artificially low permanent property tax rate that we have here in Lane County that is driving that. Our public safety levy is now not structurally balanced. Again, that is funded with a separate property tax levy, but again, property taxes. And again, that the structural imbalance in the public safety levy is due to expenses growing faster than property tax revenue is growing. Our parole and probation subfund, we've talked a lot about parole and probation and its heavy reliance, almost exclusive reliance on State Community Corrections Act funding. That funding continues to be cut each budget cycle from the state government. That impacts largely our parole and probation team, where we've been forced to make a number of elimination of positions to staffing that is already under the staffing levels that it should be, as well as in the sheriff's office. Our jail relies on support from Community Corrections Act funding, and we've also been forced to make some reductions in jail funding. Health and Human Services, and I'll ask those around the table if anyone would like to touch on, add anything to these funds that you all are responsible for managing. In Health and Human Services, again, we have heavily relying on federal and state dollars. The clinics, as well as the non-clinic areas and our lane care, you see those three listed there, heavily reliant on federal and state dollars. In the clinics, again, we saw rapid expansion over several years, additional funding coming from Medicaid expansion, and the push to expand, to hire staff, to open clinics, and we did an incredible job of moving from 2 to 3 clinics up to 9, and now we're in the position of needing to make some corrections to that as a result of declining revenues and the threat of continued declining revenues in that area. Land management and waste management, we talk about as enterprise funds. So those enterprise funds are defined by a fee that is charged, that is restricted for that, for the purpose of providing those services. Land management is primarily reliant on fees for service, as is waste management. In most other county governments across the state, the general fund supports land management, because there's a recognition that we want to try to keep fees at a level that are affordable for development and for the permits that our residents ask for. We don't have the ability, because we don't have enough general fund to support our sheriff's office, our district attorney's office, our assessor's office, and the other foundational services that counties were created to do. So we can't subsidize land management. So it puts a lot of pressure on fees to support that operation, as well as on the staffing that's necessary to be able to do the work, right? There's a balancing act there. I saw there was a question.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Mokrajski, just a definition, delineation, waste management fund. We're talking about solid waste. Liquid waste is a different system that is government operated, government run, very efficient system, very closed system, less susceptible to outside influences, and with a greater self-determination. And as we go through solid waste versus liquid waste, we need to continue to draw those parallels. How is our liquid waste functioning in the metropolitan area, and how are we extending it beyond the metropolitan area, which is important to everybody inside of this room. But once again, a strict delineation that liquid waste and solid waste are handled very, very differently, and there are a lot of outside influences that affect solid waste.
Thank you, Commissioner. We've talked a lot with the board recently about our waste management system and how critical it is for us to maintain a public waste management system, not unlike wastewater systems that are public or drinking water systems that are public. There is a public interest in having a solid waste system that is both regulated and managed, components of it managed by the public.
And managing the asset, which is Lane County's asset.
Right. Thank you. So in terms of waste management, that is the largest enterprise fund that we have. Again, it's heavily reliant on fees. What we've seen recently, what's driving the structural imbalance there is the exportation of waste by one of our waste hauler companies, Waste Connections Incorporated. And so, that's a big, broad organizational issue for Lane County, as well as community issue, really, to engage with our community around the extent to which we want to continue to have a publicly managed and regulated solid waste system versus a fully privatized system. So that is an important issue. Law, library, and county clerk funds are smaller funds, but they're heavily reliant on fees from state government, and the fees are not adjusted in a way that keep up with inflationary costs. So these are all, and I'll say the comment at the bottom here about property taxes, everything goes back to the property tax rate and limitations that we have in Lane County on our property tax rate. That is the place that general service governments like Lane County are able to, cities and counties are able to look, and state governments, able to look at their general fund to their property taxes and say, gosh, we have a need over here, and prioritize. We just simply have never been in that position in the last 30 to 30 plus years, I would say, in particular in Lane County, to be able to have the ability, the luxury to have the discretion to say, we'd like to put some property taxes over here because it's a priority for the community. So that issue of the fundamental underfunding of our government services that Lane County is responsible for is a real challenge that we need to address. So this slide here shows you full-time equivalent positions, so number of positions in Lane County going back about 10 years. And you'll see the growth that happened, from 2015 through 2023-24. That growth was all driven by state and federal dollars. It was Medicaid expansion. It was increase in the state's prioritization of developmental disabilities in the K plan. It was increase in funding for public health because the state prioritized public health. All of those things. So as the state and federal government say, here's a priority, we want to focus in this area and improve in this area, and we're going to allocate resources to do that, we see growth. That growth is not reflected in other areas of Lane County, namely in our public safety and general government services, because the growth was all tied to special revenue, right? That's why they're special revenue funds. That special revenue that came for dedicated purposes from the state and federal government drove that growth. And now we're starting to see the correction, the state and federal government saying, we're going to make reductions here. We saw that in HR 1, we're seeing that in the state's budget challenges. And so we are now being forced to make reductions. Those reductions are happening largely right now in our Health and Human Services Department, as well as in some public safety areas. But the largest number are coming in Health and Human Services because of the reductions in state and federal dollars. Anything anyone else wants to say? You can go ahead to the next slide. All right, so we'll shift and talk for a minute here about property taxes. And you've seen this slide before. This is the 36 counties in Lane County. It shows the permanent property tax rates. So this is the level at which county governments across Oregon tax their local residents to provide services. Just the county portion. This doesn't show cities or special districts or schools or any of that. You'll see Lane County towards the bottom of this list at $1.28. Okay, Deschutes County is the only other comparable county to Lane that is down there, and we'll show this chart. So this is sort of the historic slide we always show to give you the, again, this is sort of the aggregate look. It's sort of the simple look, and we're gonna try to get a little bit more nuanced in our evaluation of that. So here, what we've done is say, well, let's take a look at Lane County compared to our comparable counties that we are more like, based on population, based on urban and rural mix, based on like services. Counties in Oregon are very different. But these 5 other counties are the most similar to Lane: Jackson County, Washington County, Marion County, Clackamas, and Deschutes. They all have reasonably large metro areas, and they all have rural components. They all have services that are generally similar to the services that Lane County provides, but you'll see a difference when we look at the permanent property tax rates, and Lane County stands out here again as being by far the lowest. Jackson County at over $2, and then Washington County, Marion at over $3. Clackamas, when you add on an enhanced law enforcement permanent levy that they have, they're well over $3, close to $4. And then Deschutes County, that has 2 public safety districts, permanent districts. One in the rural, the orange, the $1.55 is the rural rate, and the kind of gray $1.25 is the urban rate. Sorry, is the county, let me get this right. The $1.55 is the unincorporated rate, and the $1.25 is the countywide rate. So if you are a resident living in unincorporated Deschutes County, you're paying a you know, roughly over $4 rate, compared to a Lane County unincorporated resident that's paying $1.28. Doesn't include school district or special districts, right? But in the unincorporated areas, we don't have cities, so a comparison there. And then let's go a little bit deeper. So what we did here is say, well, let's look at the counties plus their permanent rates, plus the median of the city, of their cities, right? In Lane County, we have 12 cities, so the rates vary depending on the cities, but we chose the median. And you see Lane County here is at the top of the list. So we start to see that when we add in the city, the median of the city, which is the midpoint of all the city rates, plus the county rate, it's not that our residents are necessarily paying significantly less. If you're in the unincorporated areas, that's true. You are. Because the unincorporated residents are not paying a city rate, and they're paying a much lower county rate than they are in the other counties. But if you live in a city in Lane County, you're actually up there with Marion in terms of the property. So this is a look from the property taxpayer standpoint. Go ahead to the next one. And this is also a look at the property taxpayer standpoint, but this is another look at that, and that is to say this is weighted. So it's weighted, it's the median city rate weighted by population. So it's, I would argue this is the best, the most sort of accurate reflection of what the majority of our residents in Lane County and the residents in these comparable counties are paying, For example, the city of Eugene's permanent property tax rate is over $7. And so that represents, so if you look at Eugene, Springfield, and where most of the population is, Lane County is number 2. It's still right there with Marion County. So we're at the top. If you're sitting in the taxpayer seat, we're actually at the top of our comparables list. But the rates and the revenue collected is disproportionately in Lane County supporting the incorporated municipalities, not the counties. So there's a big mismatch. And one could argue inequity in terms of how Lane County is funded locally compared to its comparable counties across the state, and how our city governments are funded locally compared to how the comparable cities in Lane County. Okay. And then if you wanted to just kind of get a little bit more head spinning going on, you can, and again, you don't have to, we have to go so far down this. These are good slides if you want to look back at it, but this shows you, if you want to know kind of specifically, or, you know, each commissioner has different cities. You all have different cities in your districts that you represent. If you don't know, where does my city or the cities in my district sit, it gives you an idea of what those rates looks like. So in Lane County, $8.29 is the average, is the weighted median that our Lane County resident is paying, city rate and county rate. Does that make sense? So if you're in Eugene, Oak Ridge, Cottage Grove, you're paying about $8.29. If you're in Junction City, Veneta, Springfield, you're paying around $6.50 to $7. Okay, and then you can see the cities that are lower on that list. But you see why, you know, the midpoint, the weighted median gets residents up to over $8.
Sorry, Steve, that does not include school districts then?
It doesn't include school districts, doesn't include fire districts, it doesn't include special levies. So thank you. It's not the total picture, but it is, you know, all of the counties and cities and all of our comparables and in our community have some level in special districts. You know, we all have levies, and we certainly could do a look at that. It would become more complex, but we just wanted to get an idea of where we see the greatest variation. And then you can go to the next slide. And this will be the last of the kind of head spinners for you. This shows, again, those comparables. So you see Lane County in the dark blue, second from the right, and then the other comparable counties. So you see Marion County in the orange on the far right, and all their cities, so sort of how they stack up. Again, it's interesting to look at when you have some time to sort of, and it's, you know, important to have these conversations, and we just want to be having this conversation about why we're facing this challenge in Lane County that is different. It's complex. It is now being driven particularly by state and federal reductions, but it's historically been constrained by an artificially low permanent property tax rate. This is the challenge that we've been fighting for decades and has never been corrected. And if we're going to solve particularly the public safety and in general government sort of underfunding, we've got to attack this problem from a revenue standpoint. It's not that we're overspending, it's that we're under-resourced in terms of our ability to actually collect the revenue necessary to meet the needs. That doesn't mean, though, that our taxpayers are not under-tax burdened. So this is a really difficult balancing act that we're going to have. And the board has been having conversations, of course, about the need for additional public safety funding. And we've had these conversations over decades. And we're trying to add another level of nuance and understanding about the history of the problem, as well as, the challenges we face here in Lane County in delivering services to the community that are much needed, as well as the challenges that our residents face in terms of the taxes and the affordability and median income and all of those things that are also real. Okay. So you've seen this slide. Since our permanent property tax rate was so low, we, several decades ago, Congress was helpful in identifying federal funds for federal counties across the country that rely heavily on federal lands, that have a lot of federal land in their jurisdictions, and said, as laws have changed around logging on federal lands, due to the spotted owl and restrictions on logging, we're going to provide some federal subsidy to make up for your loss of timber revenue, because we've been so heavily reliant. We didn't need a permanent property tax rate that was over $1.28 in Lane County, when we had, tens of millions of dollars coming in from logging on federal lands. But then when that went away, the federal government stepped in and said, well, we'll subsidize that. We'll help keep you whole for a while. But you can see what happens when federal and state, when you're heavily reliant on dollars from the federal and state, over time, inevitably, those are subject to change because Congress changes, administration change, and priorities. We see this in the legislature too. Something's a priority, and then enough time goes by and there's a different priority, and funding dries up. So we see that steady decline, and the big cliff that in the around 2012, we saw a big drop off in secure rural schools funding. The secure rural school funding that has funded both the general fund and the road fund, and it's just been this slow, sort of steady decline. You see 2 years that are particularly low in 2016-17 and 2024-25. Those were the years we didn't receive a secure rural schools federal payment. The Congress did not approve payments in those years. And so we accepted the actual timber harvest. A side note that the timber harvest in the general fund, which is O&C dollars, the actual harvest numbers are better than the SRS numbers in the general fund. In the road fund, the federal forest numbers are worse. The actual receipts are worse than the SRS payment. The converse is true with SRS, but you can see the total dollars from the SRS payments are better, so we typically accept the total dollars, and then we try to do some reconciliation. Some of the road fund dollars can be spent on public safety. I will say, while we had the transportation package that had been approved, which meant more funding for our road fund, it would have made it much easier to say, well, we could take maybe some of the funding from the SRS payment to the road fund and help support public safety in the general fund. That's more difficult to do now with so much uncertainty in the road fund. Okay. So that funding source is not a good one, and we don't rely on, we several years ago weaned ourselves off of operational reliance on secure rural schools, and we budget the smallest harvest number that we expect. We try to get real about not inflating the budget or making it, unrealistic in terms of our expectations. So if we do get an SRS payment, we try to use that then as one-time funding for one of these areas. Could be road infrastructure, could be public safety needs. Want to just briefly touch on the places over the last decade that we have really tried to focus as we faced these low property tax rate challenges, cuts from the state and federal government, what have we done to try to address this? And you see the list here. On the resource side, we've done some levies. You know, we do have the public safety levy that's had great success in being able to stabilize our ability to maintain a stable and reasonable jail population that the community needs. We have had the Parks Levy that has helped, you know, provide a little bit of needed infrastructure funding for our park system. A recent public safety funding task force that is was completed, and the board is now actively engaged in work to try to have a conversation with the community about how we can improve. So that's the resource standpoint. On the expense side, we've done a lot of work, focused largely on that employee benefit side of things. We have not wanted to deteriorate our benefits for our employees, but we said as that cost grows 10, 15, 20%, if health insurance grows in the market by that rate, that's just more dollars we have to divert into something that doesn't add more value. It's not adding 10, 15, 20% additional value to employees. It's just taking more and more money for the same thing. So how do we manage that expense better so that we can continue to provide the benefit, but it doesn't cost the taxpayers? We don't have to put our taxpayer dollars into that. We can put the taxpayer dollars into direct service. Does that make sense? So a lot of work around shifting, and we're going to continue that effort. That's an engagement effort with our employees that we need. We need everyone to understand how healthcare and wellness is both a personal responsibility and an organizational responsibility. But we need to manage that cost effectively. Pension, bond, insurance, side accounts, this is something we've also done with limited limitations on our ability to impact, because the pension system is state-run and there are fewer things that we can do. But we have captured every opportunity to try to manage those pension expenses and reduce our obligations in any way possible. Paid off debt. We've identified ways with SRS dollars. One-time money, we've said if we get a payment, let's pay off debt and relieve the interest rate costs. We're not paying the bank that money, right? We're reducing our own expenses. We strengthen our financial policies, made sure that we have stable reserves in place so that we can weather these storms that we have without having to immediately go and say we're just going to lop off a bunch of positions, so that when we do have to reduce, we're being more strategic and targeted in that to actually reflect where the reduction in expense is happening. Done a lot of work around, this stuff's boring to hear, isn't it? It's not fun to hear, but it's much better that we focus in these areas than we impact the workforce, the people that we employ, and the people that we serve in our community. Done a lot of work around central services to say our central services, how, human resources and technology and facilities and finance and budget and all these things that support the whole of the organization are really critical for us to be a quality organization, that we provide quality services. But we have to make sure that our central services are right-sized for what we can afford. That work continues, and we are preparing a recommendation, the proposed budget, to continue to look at our central services in greater depth and see where we have opportunities for, for continued improvement, for reorganization, restructuring, and things that really make sense to meet the needs of the organization as well as the limitation on resources. We've done things like hiring chills, saying we're, exempting public safety and positions that generate revenue and that are really critical for life and safety, but trying to slow in other areas where we can. And then service reductions, that we've talked about and that you've seen. We have had to make some targeted service reductions based on targeted reductions in state Community Corrections Act funding, in state and federal funding, in health and human services, and other places. We've really focused on creating a structurally balanced budget. So we're not each year digging into our reserves to balance the budget, because all that does is kick the can down the road. The problem grows bigger, and we sort of remain blind to the fundamentals. So we have done a very good job of making steady, long-term investments that reduce expenses, as well as strategic reductions that are necessary to structurally balance the budget and not just kick the can down the road. Technology updates, we've really looked at how can we be more efficient and effective in our utilization of technology. Every other meeting has a conversation about artificial intelligence and the ways in which we can utilize the growing influence of artificial intelligence to help arm our workforce and our community to meet the needs that are necessary. Okay, this is my last slide. This is the problem we face next year. It is not the totality of the problem, it is the general fund problem. So you saw the laundry list of structurally imbalanced funds. This is just the general fund. Because it is the most distressed, it's where everyone else relies on some portion of the general fund and the health of the general fund, and it's where we are already so under-resourced in critical, primarily public safety and general government services. $2.9 million structural imbalance. When we met with you in December, that number was around pushing $6 million. So we've done some work on this. There has been some things that have worked in our favor, some things that have not worked in our favor. On the property tax side, as the assessor indicated, we were originally projecting 3.75% growth in property taxes. You see now 3.3. So that has, because of the things the assessor talked about, there's a slowing that's happening in new construction, and so our projection is a little bit softer than it was back in December. But we've done some things. We've looked at our vacancy variance. This projection includes an accounting for vacancy variance, which is our budgeting, our assumption that we will have vacancies throughout the course of the year, and we build that into the budget so that it's a true budget. So you see this, but the problem is our revenue is growing on average 3.3%. I think property taxes are actually 3.25%. So we had estimated 3.75. We are now estimating 3.25. The total revenue is 3.3%. You see property taxes are most of that, so that's driving it. Our expenses are growing at 5.5%. That's the gap. Very simple math problem, very complex if we try to solve it in a thoughtful, nuanced way, which is what our goal always is. So we'll talk sort of at the end after Christine gets through her part and you decide if you want to take a break or not, Chair, on some things we would want direction on. I will also say here, this does not account for the approximately $5 million over the next 2 years that we need to support the added patrol. The sheriff and I have this conversation about it's not enhanced. We're not using the word enhanced patrol because it really is like we added a few positions, right, in the outlying east and west lane areas to try to get to a place where we can just have 24/7 coverage, right? So it's very minimal. It is extremely minimal patrol service that our sheriff's office is providing, and yet it is slated to the funding for that added patrol will run out at the end of this fiscal year. So we need to solve that problem. The board has said you want to solve that problem. And so, you know, I've already taken the direction that we are seeking to propose a budget that includes funding to support that 24/7 patrol operation. Again, very minimal. So it's not adequate. It's not at all adequate, but going below that is simply unacceptable. So this $2.9 million does not include the $5 million over 2 years, right? So about $2.5 million a year that we need just to do that. And our goal here is to create a a 2-year bridge to get to a place to allow the board and the sheriff and the district attorney and all of us to have a conversation with the community about a longer term solution. So this doesn't include that, but we are working on solving that challenge in addition to that. So I'll pause here if there are any questions.
Vice Chair Buck.
As we've been talking about budget gaps in individual divisions over the past year, we have utilized sometimes one-time funds or reserves to close those gaps. So my question is, in light of no new additional revenue projected, where are we with adequate reserves that are arguably there for bad weather days like what we're projecting?
Yeah, so the board's policy is a minimum of a 20% reserve for the general fund and for generally for operating funds, we do have a higher reserve requirement in certain funds that have a significant equipment replacement, for example, waste management or the road fund, where there's a lot of equipments that cost a lot of money to replace. And so we sometimes will have a slightly larger reserve in that place because we're accounting for the road fund, for example, where we know we have a lot of infrastructure that needs road infrastructure that has to be invested in. So setting those funds aside where the reserves are larger to account for that. The minimum reserve that the board has identified in your financial policies is 20% for the general fund and other operating funds, and we are continuing to meet that. That is always our goal, is that we will maintain that 20% reserve, which allows for both cash flow reserves as well as emergency reserves. I don't know if you want to add any.
Maybe just to give you an idea, and I don't have exact numbers, and they'll change as we go through 26, 27, right? Because we have to build, but just thinking about, to give you an idea of that split of the cash flow reserve is about 17% of the 20. So 3% is what we refer to as a service stabilization reserve. And this is also in the board's policy, in Lane Manual, that would be the piece in case there was a short-term emergency need of a service. There are conditions that the board put on themselves. You look at things like employment rates, housing, some economic things where it's an anomaly. It's not just like you're going to use that money and the problem's still going to be there the next year. And that's about $3 million, between 3 and 4 million, just to give you an idea of that service stabilization reserve. And then I'll just add, we had, and have a little bit excess over that. Some of it was still the COVID money that we received. We were very diligent about, we don't know what's coming still. We're going to put that aside. Excuse me. And you saw the board allocate those for places like parole and probation and the sheriff's office, and Service Stabilization Center, being able to purchase land there. So a lot of that has been tapped, but we'll be looking at, okay, what does that look like once we have all the numbers, and is there ability to recommend some bridging, like the county administrator said?
We also, we primarily care about the financial stability of our funds and our ability to deliver services and having reserves that help us withstand challenges. It's also important to note that bond rating agencies look at reserves, and they watch to see if your reserve dips below a policy that you've established, and particularly 20%, below 20% would be problematic. That would be a flag for bond rating. So in that to impact our bond rating. Our bond rating, of course, affects the extent to which we can borrow money at the lowest possible cost. And we have a lot of needs. We have facilities that are in need of repair. We know that we have a far outdated courthouse facility. Sometimes these conversations are difficult because we struggle to fund all of the services that are needed in the community, but then we also have these facilities that are really critical that are needed in order to deliver services as well. And it was 7 years ago, I think, 6, 7 years ago, that we had the really significant conversation with the community about the courthouse replacement, and we have not had that, and the problem hasn't gone away, right? We just have been, the facility continues to age. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. I know your question, Commissioner, was about our ability to maintain reserves to withstand financial challenges, and but it's also important to note that our reserves also exist for both financial stability and credibility, as well as for facility repair.
Commissioner Farr.
Thanks, Chair. Steve, as you point out the deficit we have in terms of permanent rate, it's also important to understand that Oregon is among the lowest, but it's actually dead center in terms of percentage of housing costs that is spent on property taxes. People think we're highly taxed in Oregon, but we're right dead middle as far as property taxes. In addition to that, we don't have sales tax, which does place an unrealistic burden on income tax in Oregon. But we're not overly taxed as a state in property taxes, and we're at close to the lowest in Lane County in our permanent tax rate for the county, the cities and school districts notwithstanding. Cities and school districts tend to get their asks funded by the people who live in their jurisdiction. And that's historically, that is the case, particularly in Eugene, particularly in 4J. and in Bethel for that matter, but, that's just the way it is. But the one thing I wanted to point out, Steve, is through the years, one thing that we have done, and this really needs to be elevated highly, is weaning ourselves from dependence on SRS for ongoing funding. We used to. When I got here, we were using that to fund all kinds of things. We did, and as that diminished, we have done a superb job, in my estimation, of making certain that it is used for appropriate purposes like long-term or early payoff of debt. We pay off debt early, and for one-time purposes such as a particular construction need, but not using it for chronic, ongoing needs because it's not dependable as such. And the same thing with the reserves. It's not prudent to spend our reserves on chronic ongoing needs. Reserves are there to be there for a host of reasons. And if we do use them for a bad weather day, for instance, we have to have a means to replace them. If we use them and they're down there forever, at that point we lose bond ratings and far more than that. We lose the stability that we owe the people who live in Lane County. So I think, Steve, one thing I will point out that I'm not going to say you've done this personally, but it happens to be since you got here, we've done a superb job of creating a structural balance in our budget. Despite the many challenges that come in from so many different areas, we do have a far more stable budget than you see in other counties, including counties that get a lot more in permanent rate than we do for their general fund. Most people in our community don't understand that, and I think the more we highlight that, the better off we are. Our property taxes are low. Oregon's property taxes are low regarding owner-occupied housing, and we continue to be structurally balanced our budget in what is not a very good environment.
Chief.
Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair. I'd like to speak to the estimation and declining revenue for property taxes, just what goes into that formula, and the competing factors that we look at and why that changed in a month, just a little over a month's time. With the short session on the horizon, there's an economic prosperity push, and part of that is looking at enterprise zones. So enterprise zone exemptions are 3 to 5 year exemptions for large companies. And we look, when I do the estimate, we look at that revenue coming on the tax roll. Well, with this economic prosperity bill, it's indicating that those enterprise zone exemptions will go from 3 to 5 years to 10 years. So that's not yet passed, but it's something I have to consider. Another thing that we look at are appeals and large value appeals, and the property valuation board, the local board where you can appeal. The deadline was December 31st. It's PVAB, Property Value Appeal Board. That was December 31st, and we just learned that there's some pretty high value appeals that came online, so we have to consider those. Yes, there's lower interest rates, but the permit activity in 2025 did soften, like we talked about, and also late filing for exempt properties and the impacts that those had on assessed values. So it's definitely, all of these things go into that estimation, and I just wanted to sort of speak to some of those things.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner Trigger.
Thank you. Appreciate Commissioner Farr bringing up where Oregon sits nationally. And if you go back to the slide, best call it the paint splatter, the one that shows our property tax rate by city within the county, the vertical, yeah.
The Jackson Pollock.
The Jackson Pollock one was, you were on the right one.
Which one?
That one, but then the next one, as I said to Commissioner Farr, I call that the Jackson Pollock slide. But the one before it is more relevant because we're talking about Lane County here as far as not only are we not necessarily overtaxed, as Commissioner Farr mentioned, as a county relative to the state, but we are nowhere near equitably taxed as a county. And I'm looking at that midpoint line around $6 and which communities are above it and which communities are below it. And if you broke those communities out by median income relative to property tax burden, wow. I mean, the fact that we have Oak Ridge above that line and Springfield below that line both in terms of median income and number of properties, that's astounding. That's an astounding picture of inequality. I don't know where to go with that comment right now as it relates to the conversation we're here to have, but I couldn't not note that.
Yeah, and thank you, Commissioner. And an important point there is it's important to know, like, the rate that's set, the dollars actually collected by the government are based on the values. So it's the rate times the value, right? And so an example is for example, the city of Eugene, there's a lot of value within Eugene. There's a lot of commercial, industrial, and residential value there. In Oak Ridge, not so much. So sometimes you do see in smaller, more constrained economic communities, the rate is high because they need to have a higher rate in order to just capture enough to deliver. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Even though
absolutely.
the value is really low, so they have to, but it's important to look at, in those areas where there's a lot of value.
Yes. And my point is also if countywide, the value and the benefit of that value was shared differently, those communities wouldn't be under that kind of strain necessarily.
Chair, just if it's okay, one other comment that I want to make, because we did sort of touch on bond ratings, and we don't really talk about this, but it happened now 8 or 9 years ago. But in 2017, Lane County's bond rating, we had what was considered an upper middle range for our bond rating. We were a AA3 prior to 2016. In 2017, we were upgraded to a AA2, which is the third highest rating by Moody's, which brought us into the high grade. And then in 2018, I believe it was in 2018, we were upgraded again to a AA1, which is where we sit today. That's the second highest bond rating that Moody's provides, and it's in that high grade. The only place we can go from here, and the importance of that is two things. One, a higher bond rating means lower interest rates to borrow money, which is important if we're doing construction projects. Two, it's a reflection of the quality of a number of things, but particularly the way in which, it's a reflection of the way in which we're managing the resources that we have and planning for the future. And so things like weaning ourselves off of SRS dollars, making sure that we have reserves that are adequate to meet our needs, dealing with the real problems in front of us. So I do like to point, it's too bad I didn't think to do that, but pointing to the bond rating and the continued maintenance of that second highest bond rating that we have should give confidence to commissioners, to our organization, and to the community that we continue to be viewed by the national and international professionals as being a quality organization to invest in based on how we manage. It doesn't mean we have enough resources to meet the needs of the community, totally different question. But in terms of how we're managing the resources we have, the reflection of that is good.
Maybe I can just add a little bit, because we just said it's the second highest, so why can't we get to the highest? They point to things that we don't have as much control over. The median income of the community, the PERS system is always brought up. So again, we do the things we can with PERS, but what's keeping us from that highest bond rating, at least the last time they reviewed us, are those more community factors, just for additional information.
Well, and that was something I was gonna ask about, and oftentimes with Moody, you get to it at some point, but can we go into the PERS bond a little bit and what that's doing for saving?
Sure. So our latest, well, we have two PERS bonds right now. So one of them was taken out in 2002. So it's about paid off. We only have a couple more years. And the idea is that you're going to borrow money at a low interest rate. So at that point, there were lower interest rates, and then you're going to invest it into the PERS system, and they have an assumed rate of about 6.7%. Some years much higher, sometimes they have losses, so there's risk, of course. But as long as it's projected that the PERS system will do a better job of investing the money that you have taken out debt, you've got some savings, the difference between your interest rate and what they're able to do. Our latest bond in 2022, we took out, and this is to pay off We look at the liability that PERS calculates for us. They'll look at our retirees and what wages are doing and the projected growth over the career of, every and lifespan of every PERS person, and they come up with what they call an actuarial liability. So if you're not fully funded, if it doesn't say, yep, you've got enough assets, you've paid us enough that you're going to pay for 100% of everybody, then you have a liability. So it's paying off that liability that we're doing with the debt. So in 2022, right before interest rates started moving, we were able to get a pretty low rate. I think it's 4%, maybe a little lower than that, in order to pay off. And we went ahead and did our entire liability that existed at the time. And so I invested that, and then as long as, again, the PERS system makes more interest. And so PERS takes what's referred to as a side account. Now they put that, we paid them $287 million, they put it in a side account, and they draw from it to pay part of our obligation every year. And so depending on how those investment earnings go, either you're going to have it last longer than 20 years if they do really well. It might be a little bit shorter than 20 years. Everything's assuming 20 years. And it's doing decent. Our side account percentage offset has decreased a little bit. It really depends on, again, how the PERS system is doing. We really would love to see it last the 20 years. We also, maybe I just want to mention too, that we did a side account in, without issuing debt. The state had what they referred to as an employer incentive fund. There was an effort to get employers to pay off their actuarial liabilities but not take out debt. And so the state said that they would match 25% of what local jurisdictions could come up with. And we put in, I believe it was 10 million, and then we did like a 6-year side account. We were looking at projections to say, hey, the rate looks like it's going to be really bad for 6 years. Let's do a side account. So we currently have 2 side accounts kind of offsetting our employer rate. A little bit of weeds, but hopefully that gave.
That's a brilliant management.
Okay, well, with that, let's take a little break, and I think we will re-adjourn at 10:40. That'll give us 12 minutes. Okay, we're back with our budget kickoff, and I believe next up is Christine Moody.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Okay.
So we will get into the weeds just a little bit more here, starting with a little bit of where we're spending our general fund right now. So the board and those who attended our meeting in December did see a little bit of this, so I'm just going to touch on it again and give you some of the highlights. So we, throughout our budget document, talk a lot about discretionary general fund. And the county administrator mentioned where we spend our general fund, that it's in those most critical areas. So this chart is actually referring to discretionary general fund. The difference between that and the big general fund number would be reserves are not in here because they're not being spent. And then departments collect revenue that they then use to support their services, and that is not in here. So this is going to be things like property tax, the SRS payment, our shared revenue with the state, liquor and cigarette, and franchise agreements, those kind of things that are county level revenue, and then we allocate it out. So just to give some context. So we are spending in the current adopted budget 74% on our public safety areas. That does include the sheriff's office, district attorney. It also includes behavioral health within Health and Human Services, and a few other areas, parole and probation, others. We have our general government direct. So that is primarily elections and assessment and taxation are really the big ones there, where they're having direct services out with the community. 13% is spent there. In the areas of public health and welfare, which includes things with our unhoused population, and things like women, infants, children, public health programs, veterans, is going to be found in the public health and welfare category of 8%. And then we go into central services that support the overall operations of the county. The Board of Commissioners is even considered here in central services, just as those things that we bill out to all of our direct services and how we pay for our central services. The general fund has to allocate an amount to cover the amount that hasn't yet been collected from departments for work done. And so that's a 3%. And then we have a few non-departmental expenses. They are things like some countywide dues. We're a member of AOC, Association of Oregon Counties. So that would be found in there. Also in that 2%, I want to point out is that we are responsible as a county for providing adequate facilities for the state court. So we're not able to bill them for facilities maintenance or custodial staff or any type of depreciation. We also pay the electrical bill. We pay for some security pieces, and so about $1 million, over $1 million is that amount a year. So that is also in the non-departmental. So just give you an idea of where we're spending it. And then just showing the dollars here. So the discretionary general fund number was about 71 million in the current year adopted budget. And so here's the dollar figures that go behind those categories that you just saw. All right, so a little bit more detail on the forecast. You saw these are projections of what ongoing revenue growth looks like versus ongoing expense growth. So 3.3% versus 5.5%. I will just point out that this slide last year, the expense was over 9%. So those steps that are being taken, as we continue to look everywhere and we make strategic reductions when needed, are having an impact on the expenditure growth. So that's a positive. That's why our number is looking a little better. Highlighting again that property tax growth number being 3.25%. Other external revenue, a lot of those things, like I said, the state shared revenue are pretty flat. Some of them are declining. Things like franchise agreements where we have cable, Comcast, has to share a % of cable. Well, cable is not as popular now as streaming TV, and so less cable subscribers mean less revenue. So we have some places where we're seeing revenue decline as well. And so that's why you don't see much growth beyond that property tax growth is the bulk of it, and then gets us to the 3.3. We are seeing a shift. What happens when you're a system of a county and all these different funds, and they're all contributing to the central service indirect costs that come with running a county, is when you have one area of the county start to shrink, some of those costs don't go away, and they move back to the other funds. So we saw it the opposite direction as the 10 years of Health and Human Services in particular growing. The general fund and other funds benefited from that as the % of indirects went more to Health and Human Services. So our indirect percentage went down. We're now seeing it start to come back, which means the general fund owes a little more towards technology services, a little more towards all of the other central services. So that's just an expense that we were aware was going to happen. It happens, we've seen it multiple times in the time I've been at the county as you have reductions in one area or growth in one area. Personnel expenses, we're assuming a 3% vacancy variance rate, so that is a big thing that's changing the number that you saw in December of up to 5 million. That did not include a vacancy variance rate. Now we've applied the vacancy variance rate. That's why you're seeing a lower number, and some additional changes that the county administrator mentioned have occurred. One of those being that we were able to analyze our medical insurance self-funded fund to see how we were doing compared to claims projections, what our reserve levels look like, and we're able to hold the rates flat for our departments for next fiscal year. That's a positive. The first forecast assumed it would increase about 5%. So what we're doing is using reserves, really, in order to pay the claims. So it's a temporary reduction, but then we hope that claims smooth out a little bit, because we have seen some increases over the last 6 months. We've seen some larger spikes in our claims. The other thing I'll mention, I didn't put it on here because it was just released, was the CPI for 2025. For the West unit, most of our, I think maybe all of our units now, all of our employees, the cost of living increase that is applied is tied to that CPI rate, and it's estimated to be 2.6%. So that's been applied as well. Programs, material and services growth, I'll mention. We look to the December Oregon Economic Forecast and what they are projecting CPI will do over the next year. They are predicting 2.5% growth. Again, for context, last year that number was 3%. So they are projecting that it will be down. And then we do have areas in material and services that you cannot hold to 2.5. You know, you have an outside vendor who's saying your software agreement is going up 5%. That is what it is. But we really strive to hold, especially the general fund, to that number. So that's why we go out and look at that. The county administrator mentioned the programs that we'll be looking for some bridge funding. So they are not in this 2.9 for deficit number that I'm giving you. They're not counted as ongoing expenditures at this point. And that was the added patrol. It had occurred 2 different times. There's a total of 10 FTE, the McKenzie West Lane, and then the second one that was funded with a road fund transfer from Secure Rural Schools money, as we mentioned. So this is just the numbers again for you, but it includes a little more detail than the chart that we result in the structural deficit of 2.9 million. So the big thing still that, you know, once our departments start building their budgets, which kickoff is next Tuesday, we don't have as much, I don't have as much window into what their revenue is doing. So we're assuming, you know, what historical growth has looked like. That's what next year growth will look like. So that can change the forecast a bit. And then those expenses, can we hold to 2.5% in material and services, or do we have places where we cannot do that? Will impact what we really end up with right prior to Steve proposing his budget. So it's kind of a, okay, departments, now you tell us if these are the best numbers beyond the revenues that are county level. All right, that's all on the forecast. Maybe into the budget calendar and the initial budget direction that we mentioned. So you saw this in a maybe a little different way at the very beginning of the county administrator's slides. We have the 2 kickoffs that are happening in January. Departments will prepare and submit their budgets. Central budget receives those in late February. And then by mid-March, we start meeting. Most of our departments will meet with the county administrator, sometimes as, you know, a central service group, or he has early meetings. He's already met with technology services for them to set their rates. So have those meetings to make final decisions about what will be in the proposed budget from the county administrator. In April, we're preparing that budget document that you'll receive with budget committee. It's printed by the end of April, out there for the public to see about a week before the budget committee meetings start. And then we'll have 5 meetings is usually what we've been doing the last few years. That's currently what's planned unless there's a change requested from the committee, where we have work sessions from departments, and you'll receive the budget message from the county administrator, and then deliberate on the budget and approve a budget from the budget committee. That will then be referred to the board, where you're able to make changes. Some of those changes, most of the changes typically are from departments telling you they have new information on something that they need to change from the time they turn their budget in late February to when we're adopting in June. And so we get the budget as close as we can to what we know at that moment in June, and then adopt that budget. So the initial budget direction is for personnel. We typically go with what the Board of Commissioners has approved. So if we have any units that are in active negotiations, which we will have, I think we've resolved all of them for the beginning of 26, 27. So it's only what's been approved by the board. That's what will be in the budget if there was anyone in negotiations. And then including a vacancy variance in all funds, that is in your financial policies, that every fund, operating fund, needs to consider whether they should be reducing their personnel budget to what they really think they're going to spend That's what a vacancy variance is. You're gonna have some vacancies. What are you really gonna spend at the end of the day? And making sure your budget is not overinflated.
I want to say that
Yes,
that's been
please.
a key tool. The vacancy variance has been a really key tool that we've, past 6, 7 years, I'd say, we've really dialed that in to say we need to get to as accurate of budgeting as possible, so we end the year, from an operating standpoint, as close to zero as possible. That makes sense, like, without touching reserves. And so it feels like each year we do a better job with data of going, okay, where do we have, and as our positions get smaller, as our budgets get tighter, that does get, the amount of variance that we can assume also gets tighter. Does that make sense?
It's a big piece of, of making sure that our budgets are structurally balanced and that they're representing what you're really gonna spend at the end of the year, all throughout. It creates a lot more administration of the budget, a lot more monitoring of the budget, instead of just budgeting for 100% employment, which is what happened when I started at the county. But it has the benefits of keeping services, because you're not gonna reduce then on a position you were never gonna fill. Because what kept happening was we would underspend our personnel budget and we'd bring forward fund balance of millions. But we'd already adjusted for the budget, and then that's one-time money. And so it really does play into the structural balance, very strongly. So we continue to watch what's happening as we get rid of more vacant positions potentially in some areas. So material and services growth of the 2.5% that I mentioned, and then the services, we have a position, it's called the performance auditor position. It has not been filled since 2019. Just for awareness, that is still billed out to our departments through our indirect plan. So it's about $175,000 a year that is billed out to departments in the event it was filled. And then the general fund covers about $70,000 a year, because we don't bill out M&S that we don't know. We're just mainly billing out the salary and benefits that we know would occur. And so that is an initial direction of potential. Yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to it. I'm speaking for your proposed budget.
Yeah, I think, we have continued to, as Christine said, that position's been vacant for 7 years or so, and the costs get billed out to departments, and there's an impact on the general fund, and so that's one item that we're putting forward, and particularly because it's a position that reports to the board, but it just has not been active. We don't have an active internal audit committee, and so at the time that we're looking at, having to continue to make reductions, it's something that we need to look at.
The other one is, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. This one is dear to me. I'm the only commissioner who remembers having a performance auditor, and I was also on the board when we created the position. Very important position that really fulfilled its needs and its projections admirably in its first few years. Had a few bumpy years, and that's one of the reasons that we lost energy, I would say, in replenishing that position. Another issue that we had is the performance auditor was required to live in Lane County. We've relaxed that a little bit. So in the future, when we do decide to fill that position, when we move in that direction, we have a lot greater latitude as to who can apply for the job. It was a relatively small number of people who were really qualified to apply for that position, based upon the relocation requirement and also the experience needs. So the field has grown, and at some point in the not too distant future, it's something we should talk about to see if that is a position that we can use to benefit virtually everything that we do, or if it's a position that maybe it's time to just cut it from the rolls completely.
Yes, Commissioner Trigger.
Thank you. Not to belabor this one particular piece, but I think it's important, and also just to really make clear for folks that are watching, it's a performance auditor. It's about the performance of programs relative to the established goals and so on. It's not about financial, just to make that really clear. I'm curious, because I do remember, I worked with past performance auditors being on the budget committee and just in the community, even though I wasn't on the boards. I'm familiar with their work and also what some other communities have done with their auditor role. And then we have some counties that have elected auditors. This is also a function that could be performed on a contract basis by program versus embedded within the organization as a line item personnel position. So even if we were to, it doesn't make it impossible for the board to consider doing an RFP to do a program audit in a particular area at any time, even if we don't have an auditor position. So I just want to note that. That's what gives me less heartburn about considering the elimination of the position entirely. And the other question I have is the amount really current? Because I know Commissioner Farr and I think Commissioner Buck were on the performance audit committee that established some of, basically modernized our understanding and expectation of the qualifications for someone in that role, but also therefore what a competitive market wage is. So I wonder if we even have it at the right number in here now.
I couldn't, and I don't think we have, HR wouldn't have that information right off, whether it's been reclassed, just because it hasn't been filled. So you're right, there's a good chance it has just stayed at the same classification at this
So
point.
I guess my point is if we were to actually move forward with direction, it actually is probably even a higher number than we think. You know? Yeah.
Well, and to the points that you both are making, thank you for the clarification. Like every year, we contract with Moss Adams. We do RFPs every few years to do financial audits. So financial audits will always continue. We have to do those. Performance audits, there was this discussion years ago, it was a decade ago, really, about the board in-house versus out. And we've had varying levels of success with in-house performance auditors over the past 12 years. We've had that position has been filled for a total of, I think, 2.5 to 3 years. So a very small amount of time, and there's been varying success with it. We have, however, been doing exactly as you suggest. We've been routinely doing performance audits, particularly of our central service areas, so technology services, facilities, human resources. We did an audit, and as I mentioned, I'm planning to propose in the proposed budget a comprehensive review, really to look at where are we and where do we need to be in terms of our central service structure. So we're always going to do what we call performance auditing, which is evaluating our success level and the things that we're saying we need to that are important. And the value of being able to go out to the private sector and do that is that there's specialized expertise within each of those areas. If you hire one person, you get a generalist who has general knowledge but not specific knowledge in each of those places. You go out to the private sector, you're able to identify individuals that have that particular expertise in the area that you're looking to evaluate.
Commissioner Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. I've looked at this position a little bit. I think the last time we budgeted for it was $189,000. So to Commissioner Trigger's point, it's probably not up to date as far as what an actual salary would be. But I think the thing that keeps me on Commissioner Farr's page is that it's a good position to have, is that this position provides the public with information on programs and whether they're achieving their outcomes or not. And so the question the public's going to have that I'm sure I'm going to field back is, without this position being filled, who decides when and how the public gets transparent feedback on how performances of programs are going?
Well, again, the position has been filled for 7 years. So we continue to do, as I said, we do financial audits every year. We contract out for reviews of performance for various areas, and those all come to the board for review and discussion. And I would say in the public sector, everything is open. Everything is open and transparent. Everything we do is out in the public. And so, the evaluation that the public gets to do is in all of the meetings that we have and the information that we present and the discussions that we have.
The other thing that I would say is that for any of our programs that are state or federally funded, we tend to have comprehensive evaluation and reporting requirements. So almost 100% of Health and Human Services falls in that category. Not quite, but pretty darn close. And we expend tremendous resources already to be capturing data, putting it in whatever format our funders are requesting and sending it off to them. We don't report all of it at this time to the board. If the board would like any additional information brought to you in public session in terms of those reporting requirements that we have and how we're performing on each of those required metrics, we would be happy to do that to a greater degree. So I think it's mostly local funding that a performance auditor would be a potential value add, depending on how you feel about wanting to audit the programs funded specifically by those local funds.
Yeah, and I would just remind and encourage Commissioner Lovell, if he's hearing from people in the public who just want to know sort of how do we know, what kind of results are we getting, kudos to the data analytics team for all the many dashboards we now have on our website by program that are a really easy way to look and see how is deflection going? What is the all-in funding delivering for us? There's several dashboards that we have that are really easily digestible about what kind of results we're achieving with certain investments.
We also, in the budget document that we publish every year, we have performance measures and reporting on all the things that by each department division. It's pretty granular in that regard. It's actually one of the things that we were noted for by the general GFOA, Government Financial Officers Association, the National Association that evaluates government budgeting processes. We every year get that award for the quality of document we put forward. This year we got a special note. Is that like a star from the teacher,
Yeah.
the star student kind of thing, for connecting performance measures to the strategic plan in the document. So, yeah, the strategic goals that we identified.
And I will add, oh, sorry. Yep. I will add, oh, go ahead.
No, I'll defer to. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I'll add to Eve's point that assessment and taxation has oversight by the Department of Revenue. And we have reports that we generate every year in order to receive our CAFA grant and funding, that we have to meet certain benchmarks every year. And I'm happy, that's public. And I'm happy to direct you to that report if you'd like.
Well, my final brief is that, that many of the things that we viewed as needing to be audited back in 2013, 2014, have been covered on a regular basis. Predominantly since Steve Mokrajewski came on board, we're measuring a lot more things, and our forward-facing dashboards, for one thing, are really easy to interpret and really easy to see both progress and efficient use of funding. If you look at, we do have our audit reports on file. You can pop online and see them. For instance, the report number 2017-03, the Annual Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline Report. The reports are all there. They were all very valuable at the time. Some of those reports are a bit obsolete, not the nature of the report, but the type of report, because we are doing them on a perfunctory basis today, and we weren't back then.
Okay. Well, sorry. Yep. Go ahead, James.
I was just going to mention that the last time that HR looked at this particular position, the performance auditor position, was about 3 years ago, so it's not as old as the last time it was filled. And certainly we could do another review, and it's possible that doing some surgical work with a outside consultancy might even be cheaper than filling a full-time position. So just wanted to mention that. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would like to continue to leave this position available. I know, I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We're coming up against tough budget cuts, but that's when you need to have all your transparency available. And I think cutting the auditor at this point would not be a great look, especially when we're going through our public safety funding task force and all these things. And one of the biggest reports we got back was we need transparency. We want to continue the transparency. And so I just think this is not a good time to be even talking about removing this position.
Okay?
I think we're back.
Yes, all right.
Thank you.
So the last one's already been mentioned by the county administrator too, is finding funding to continue that added patrol for a 2-year period. Estimated to be determined final cost is about $5 million for that. So next steps, we mentioned departments are gonna meet, they're gonna submit their adjusted base budget, that's when we're gonna verify our forecast numbers. And then the county administrator will issue any other budget direction needed in order to achieve that balanced, structurally balanced general fund budget in the proposed budget. And it could include things like spending targets, reduction in cost requests, analysis of other funding sources, just continuing to look everywhere that we can look for some strategy to balance the budget. Overall goals, of course, keeping with our structurally balancing all funds. You saw the list is getting much longer of our unbalanced funds. We typically in past years have had just a few on the list, but now we're at 10 or 11. So we evaluate those each supplemental budget, and we'll evaluate them again to see if things have changed with 26, 27. I will just mention, because Commissioner Farr pointed out that since Steve Mokrzycki started is when we have seen this structural balance. I still remember that one of the first questions he asked me was, what policy are we missing? What financial policy are we missing? And it was like, we don't have a policy on structurally balancing our budget. It's recommended by GFOA. And he said, let's do it. And why aren't we doing it? So it is directly tied to when he started because of that work moving that way. So continue to meet our reserve policies, which we are looking at each fund individually. We have a couple policies that the board sets for the road fund and the general fund. The rest, we're really gonna look at what's going on with the fund, what kind of assets they own, when the service demand is, and then seeking to limit reductions from current service level wherever possible, aligning with our strategic priorities. All right.
One thing, Chair, if I may, I wanted to just introduce a couple folks that are here. First of all, Greg Nelson from our Budget Committee is one of the resident appointed individuals. Thanks for joining us here today, Greg. And I wanted to introduce to the board and everyone, we have a relatively new budget office team who's just doing incredible work. And so I wanted to, you may all know Michelle Stark, who's back there. She's been with us. She's had some time in Public Works. She's back in the budget office doing great work. Jason Miles has been with us. You recognize Jason and his great work. And then we have two new folks. Jasper Rielgeist is here. He is apparently a big fan of Jackson Pollock because he's the one that did the bubble graph. But he's really helped out with those graphs and was relieved to know that those were well received. And so appreciate Jasper, who's actually, you may recognize from our policy lab work. He's a 3 p.m. graduate and did some work with our policy lab, and he's joined us now full-time in the budget office. And then Christina Spear is here, and she comes to us from the University of Oregon. Just incredible work happening by our budget team. If folks have not had a chance to meet, this is for everybody, please introduce yourselves. Really great work, and thanks to everyone who's here, including all of our departments and staff in the organization. Thank you.
Okay, so we will do, we kind of went through some of them, but do we have any more questions for Ms. Moody?
Oh, yeah.
Not currently. Okay, well, with that, we will, I mean, was that budget direction and next steps, or?
Yeah, I think I would ask just if commissioners, so we had a more, you know, we put the performance auditor position on there. We thought that was something that was a natural conversation to have since it hasn't been filled for so long and there hasn't been work happening in that regard. If there are other, we've shared with you the $5 million that so we have a $2.9 million structural imbalance in the general fund alone, plus $5 million we need to identify if we're going to continue the added patrol, which the board has identified so as a priority. And so if you have areas that you would like us, I'm hearing a desire not to eliminate the performance auditor position. It would be helpful to know if there are other places that you would like us to focus to close both that $2.9 million gap as well as the $5 million funding for the added patrol.
To the board. Go ahead, Commissioner Trigger.
Thank you. This is more a peek inside the process question when you meet with directors. The timing of the short session relative to the development of the budget, and we don't quite know yet, but we will soon. There are a couple of bills last session that we were really hopeful that came close but didn't quite get there. I'm thinking particularly about the CAFA grant and the expanded flexibility for locals on the state transient lodging tax side. So how much do you sort of scenario plan what would be realized if those things happened and how that might relieve pressure in some of these distressed funds?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is, in the conversations I've had, and I kind of look at Mr. Adams and folks at Schaefer on this because they're actively involved in these, it seems to me like there's some pretty strong momentum on the lodging tax side. If we were able to get some flexibility on the lodging tax side, we do have some funds that have been, that are in place related to the new 2 points the board put in place. That could be used to fund the $5 million for added patrol. That would be a really, I mean, that's immediately where I would look if that legislation passed, would be to say, the board has said this is your top priority, is to fund the added patrol to get us a bridge to the next few years. We have funding that is sitting here that doesn't require an elimination of or reduction in service in other places. So it will depend on the timing and the extent to which we believe there's a strong possibility related to when we propose the budget. And if for some reason we did propose that and the legislation didn't pass, then, you know, we would have a backup plan. That has happened before. I think back when we had the vehicle registration fee on the ballot, it didn't pass. We had to propose a budget that, you know, had to account for not knowing what the outcome of that was going to be. CAFA funding, I think, you know, our assessor is leading the state. I mean, we thank goodness we have Mary Vuksat Schaefer here, not just for the work she's doing leading assessment and taxation, but this work statewide. She's tenacious on this matter. And so I have a lot of confidence. And I will tell you on the CAFA front, I mean, for over 10 years, I've been, and others have been involved in conversations around this, and we just see stall after stall after stall. This is probably the time that I've seen the most momentum and opportunity for actually moving something in the legislature. Personally, I'm not convinced it's going to happen in the short session. I think that, you know, it sounds like maybe a study is what they will do. So I don't think that we're probably going to make movement there, but we're eyeing very closely the TLT bill.
Thank you. And I say that as much as a pin in it till our next board meeting when we talk about our guiding principles and priorities. But thank you for that.
Chair, I can add to that. What we are doing with the Association of Assessors and Tax Collectors is kind of taking a step back from the revenue sort of piece of the equation for CAFA, and we are looking at a study done by the Legislative Revenue Office. Before CAFA was passed in the 80s, there was a study that needed to be done. So it's a statewide study. This problem can't just be a Lane County fix. It has to be a statewide fix. And so in order to really get legislators engaged in the conversation, the lens has to sort of, the focus has to be the entire state so that all of the counties understand the benefit of moving forward with a revenue or a CAFA fix in the long session. And I will add that Steve will be the president of the administrators of the state of Oregon, and I will be the president of the assessors and tax collectors in the long session. So we're hoping that, with a study done by LRO, which is, a very well-respected office in the legislature, and our presidencies, that we can sort of lead this long session in 27 for a CAFA fix. So,
Vice Chair Buck, please.
Thank you. Question on the SRS funding specifically. We did not necessarily expect that would be renewed. We were hopeful. There was a lot of legwork, and thankfully it was. And it's my understanding that traditionally we utilize 50% of that for patrol, 50% of that for roads. And I'm guessing that these budget projections included that particular amount in, now that it's really effective, I think, through June 30th of this year, I believe. But we hadn't originally had that in our budget for our current fiscal year. So can you tell me how that's being incorporated in this next budget cycle, if it's already part of what the financials are that you're showing us? Because that was several $1 million that we didn't necessarily anticipate. And because the majority of the fiscal year is over, where did that funding go? Have we received it yet? And can we utilize that to help fill some of these gaps?
So it is in the forecast because the general fund does worse when we get secure rural schools. So I had to go in and decrease the revenue estimate for secure rural schools in that 2.9 million. It's a few $100,000 that we receive less. They'll probably, whether we have to pay back any, but they put a clause in there based on what you received on your timber. They're going to do the math and say you have to give some of it back. Anything over our timber harvest numbers is one-time money. So that's not in. So I have not assumed that 50% of the road fund portion would come back to help with patrol, because that's one time. So that would be more on those added patrol that's where we used that 50%. So there's potential for it to impact some of that, but that's not on those ongoing expenses. The road fund will assume, the timber harvests that go into the road fund are 100% transferred to patrol. So we already do everything we can, and that's about 1.2 million to move that ongoing revenue. And so again, they would do their own forecast, but the SRS portion will be considered one time and usually focuses on road projects. But I don't know if the Public Works Director wants to add anything. He's nodding, okay.
So I hear that it's included in the reduction of the general fund forecast, but not necessarily on the revenue side and one-time funding for particular programs?
Because I'm showing you the structural balance of the fund when I'm talking about the 2.9. So that's not going to, cover whether we have, I take out those one-time expenses. Okay. So those patrol expenses that are sitting in the general fund right now, I've removed them in order to get to the 2.9. So we put them back in, then we need a one-time revenue to cover it. So that is where the potential for the secure rural schools could come in.
And do you remember how much we received?
It's estimated to be, and they're still working on it for sure, and federal sequestration always gets in there. So they take 1% from what the numbers are published. But the road fund number is estimated to be about 5.4 million. Again, the timber is 1.2 or 1.1. So that delta is going to be the additional that we receive, and the general fund will receive a little bit less, like I said. You'd also asked if we've received it. Not yet. The legislation gave them 45 days. I'm going to be amazed if they turn that around. But they're working on it. They're calculating the numbers.
Right, and the president signed that bill right around the 17th, 18th of December. So we think kind of second week of February would be the 45 days in which the law says Treasury has to pay.
I appreciate that. It sounds like it's not necessarily in the budget yet for potential use for the additional patrol. So I'd like to discuss that part in the future to ensure that what we can utilize for keeping some of these patrol positions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I will just, the thing I mentioned earlier is a reminder that the transportation bill is now off the table, it appears, and so we have a real challenge in our road fund, and so the transfer, that is just, we need to be mindful of it. It's again why I think looking at if the legislature does advance the TLT bill for flexibility, I'm sensing support from commissioners to, Commissioner Lovell? Okay. So do you have a suggestion of how to fund the patrol?
You're kind of throwing me under the bus there, aren't you, Steve? Just
Oh,
for a
no,
second here? I just said, no, I don't support the TLT just
Okay.
because of the way the TLT funds, and it's the second largest industry we have in the area, and I don't think we should be messing with it at a tenuous time where we're at economically, no.
Totally understand. The board has identified that as the top priority, so I just want to ask if you had a suggestion.
Okay, any other next steps, final thoughts by commissioners? Commissioner Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. I have three final thoughts if we're going to move forward of what people have been telling me they want me to pass on. I think the first thing is, the whole state and federal mandate conversation we keep having about what's funded and what's not funded, what's underfunded, what's asked of us and all that. I think people are at the point where they're just saying, look, whatever dollars we have to do whatever service the state is mandating us to do from the state, those are the dollars that we should supply the service on, whatever that level of service is. So that's probably the first thing that people are telling me what to pass on. The second thing is as you said, Mr. Mokrajewski, we had some increases in programs and that sort of thing with ARPA money and that sort of thing. And the terms limited duration and limited in duration were thrown around. And so some of those terms, they appear to be similar or the same, but as I understand it, they're different. So I think what I'd like to know, just in closing, is what is limited duration and what is limited in duration, and how are they different? And if they're limited in duration, when those durations end, logically, the public is saying then that program or that thing should end. So I think that's maybe one bit of clarity before I go into the third point. So please go ahead.
Sure. So limited duration is actually defined by the board, and it was adopted by the board as a type of appointment for employees. Right now, it's only used with our non-represented employees, is where we have just a couple of them. They have different benefit levels, and that's the main change. And that they are for a maximum of 2 years. So very defined in your policies. And then we have limited in duration, and we have always had limited in duration because we have so much grant revenue. So, when we receive grants, our policies have always said when the grant sunsets, if it sunsets, that position is tied to the grant, the position needs to go away. And so that's where you'll see us talk about limited in duration. Again, it's non-represented. I think we have one other labor agreement. I know Inga's on TM today, so I can't ask her. I think our 626 unit has limited duration in their agreement. That's the only bargaining unit that has agreed to have that limited duration definition that the board had. So we don't see any of those in our represented staff. Does that provide enough? Yeah.
That's good. Thank you for that clarity. I appreciate that. And so as the people asked. The third thing that I want to say is referred to Commissioner Farr. He had referenced the 2017 performance audit report. There's also a 2017 performance audit report about recruitment and retention that I found interesting reading, all 540 pages of it, if I might add. But it was done by a PhD. Obviously, the last performance auditor we had was a PhD, so he's very technical in the way he writes. But he had a quote in here that I thought was really interesting that maybe I would like to put forward as what we think about when we're going forward in the budgeting process. He said, "For its evidence, rather discernibly, throughout the idiosyncratic history of business, that if professional working organizations are to subsist among the three primary branches." So basically, I only break that down. What he's saying in that bunch of words is, if things are going to proceed on in a logical, cost-benefit manner, and he says the three primary branches, public, private, and voluntary, those are the three industries we work with within our organization, private, public, and voluntary organizations, they themselves must never be untenable, which means they should not be found to be, if they're found not to be self-sustaining and maintained, then they should become irrelevant and therefore obsolete. That's how he takes that quote and wraps it up. So I guess what I would like to see us do is obviously we've mentioned some things about AI and some other things that are changing, and Commissioner Farr said something about 2013 that we're not doing anymore. There's been shift culturally and shift business-wise. Obviously, we're all aware of that. But I think as we move forward, I think that we need to look really hard at some of the things that cannot maintain on its own, cannot be self-sustaining, and or have fulfilled the purpose and place those purposes within the organization as benchmarks and pillars that we now operated from that may be therefore obsolete in this season and should be considered reevaluating if they're needed to be budgeted for or not. So I think that was was a golden gem for me from the performance auditor of past, and I was just wanted to pass that on, so thank you.
Do you want to articulate any obsolete areas that you think should be?
No, not at this time, sir.
Okay. So, happy to.
Happy to talk to you behind, in my office, that'd be great.
Okay. I'd rather that we talk about this in the public. Go ahead, Chair.
Thank you, County Administrator. Anybody else for final thoughts? Okay, well, I'll just say that I am going to continue to support public safety. My email is ever full with people, and this is no detriment to our sheriff's department, but with concerns about calling 911 and saying either nobody's coming or they're an hour and a half away. These are hard emails to respond to. These are hard emails to communicate with the people about. They're hard emails to forward on to our sheriff because I know he doesn't like hearing it. And that's not the way Lane County needs to be known as for public safety. In fact, I think next week we're heading into a meeting with, sounds like about everybody north of Florence to talk about this because they've had multiple instances out there and the communities are concerned. So I have prioritized public safety and said I prioritize public safety, and on my watch, West Lane has lost half of their patrol. It's really hard to go back over to Florence and explain to people why that's happened. So I trust this process and I trust we will do what we can. And I don't take this TLT tax lightly. That's not where I would like to go because that is a huge industry here in Lane County. And I believe our partners in the TLT in the TLT world work hard for good results in that money. That being said, we are at the point where we're making tough decisions. So, on that note, I hope we can work through this and we can get patrol where it needs to be. And if that's it for everybody, I think that's where we're going to end this meeting. Thank everybody for their hard work, budget staff. Once again, you guys did a great job. And new budget team members, this is what happens. We appreciate it, and that was you guys jumped right into the fire. So thanks everybody, appreciate it. Sure.